Okay, so I just want to talk about policy because this is a significant uh, a pillar in the whole culture of the workplace around being diverse and inclusive. And policy, depending on the nature of the work that you do, the size of your organization, and the context of the work that you do, you may have a number of different policies that support and promote diversity and inclusion in the workplace. I particularly want to focus on the two main ones, which is an overarching diversity and inclusion policy, and I also want to have a look at an equal opportunity um, policy after this. So let's unpack a diversity and inclusion policy. Let's start off on that. A diversity and inclusion policy is an overarching statement by an organization that is is developed to inform all key stakeholders of the organization, both internal and external, of the organization's commitment and intent to create a diverse and inclusive and equal workplace for all. So it's the statement that is about letting everybody know how we stand on this particular issue, and this issue is diversity and inclusion. It should set out the rules and the guidelines for the organization and all employees to follow. And when I say employees, I'm talking about all levels of the organization, from the most senior manager to the most junior employee. The policy should outline what all key stakeholders must do in relation to, in this case, diversity and inclusion, and what it must not do in creating a diverse and inclusive workplace. So I thought the best way to do this is to unpack an example. Um, so a really good, clear diversity policy, which I think is a good one to talk through, is the Lifeline Australia diversity policy. This one's actually outdated. It was up for review in 2020, and I'm assuming that it has been reviewed, but it's a nice one for us just to unpack anyway and have a look at it. So a good policy should really have some of the key headings on it, or the key uh, points around the policy. And in this case, it's going to start off with a purpose and a background. It'll look at things like its application and its objectives or commitment and how it gets implemented. Um, and it will also look at things such as the different roles within that. So what's what's the what are the key roles and what are the commitments, and the reporting of it. So and each policy will be different depending on, as I said before, the size of your organization, how many other policies it interacts with or um, encompasses, and so forth. So a good policy should be um, as simple and succinct as possible. It should not be too wordy or verbose. Whenever we're writing these documents, we want to make it as succinct as possible, as clearly written as possible, so that anybody can pick it up and have a the same understanding of it. So let's step through this one. A policy should start off with a purpose. And if we look at this one as an example, it starts off with Lifeline Australia recognises that to achieve its purpose, it must be a leader in relation to workplace diversity and flexibility. This policy sets out Lifeline Australia's objectives for achieving workplace diversity and flexibility, how it will achieve those objectives, and how it will measure those achievements. Now, I'm not going to read all the way through it because it would really extend this tutorial, but just going to pick out a couple of these key lines. There's a copy of this also available in the resources, so you can access that and have a read through it, which I recommend. So then we'll go into, so the first part should be to have a good, clear purpose. What's the purpose of this? How does it fit into what you're doing? Then the background. The background is probably not an essential one, but it's always nice for the key stakeholders to know how this fits in. And in the Lifeline one, it says on the 9th of September 2011, the Board of Lifeline Australia resolved to adopt and apply as appropriate the principles and recommendations of the Australian standards, good governance principles, and the Australia Stock Exchange corporate governance principles and recommendations as a basis for Lifeline's approach to corporate governance. Document any exceptions considered appropriate. And then it talks about the board's commitment. So it's just sort of because there's a context to this, they want to make that clear and as transparent as possible. For your organization, if you're a small business, you may not necessarily need to put that. You may want to merge that into part of your purpose, perhaps talk about the purpose and the context of that purpose. You don't necessarily have to have these headings or separations, but in this case, Lifeline have seen that to be an important element. So then we flow into introduction. Lifeline Australia aims to actively promote a corporate culture that supports diversity in the composition of its board, senior management, in the workplace, and amongst its members. So they've really addressed for Lifeline all the levels of the organisation there in saying that they want to promote a culture of inclusion across all levels. A corporate culture that embraces diversity, seeks to encourage and facilitate opportunities for the employment of women and people from different backgrounds, provide skills and career development initiatives, increase workforce participation, and create an inclusive environment where directors, employees, and the clients who use our services feel they are valued in building a corporate culture where diversity is encouraged. Lifeline Australia also recognises that employees at all levels have responsibilities outside of the workplace. So then it goes on just to break down these key points within the introduction, and that's really just about, again, promoting that key message. Then the application of its policy. This policy applies to the board, its committee, management, employees, including job applicants, where relevant, and stakeholders, especially our clients who use Lifeline services. So again, depending on the size of your organization and governance requirements and the context and so forth, for a small business, you may incorporate the purpose, the introduction, and the purpose, the background, the introduction, and the application of policy all into one. And it might be just a statement saying something like, we recognize that to be a leader in our field, to represent our broader community, and to attract the very best people to our organization, both as internal stakeholders or employees and clients, we need to be committed to diversity and to inclusion. And we are committed at all levels of the organization to that. So, you might have something like that. And then that flows into your commitments and objectives. And again, depending on your organization, depends on what kind of overarching objectives you're making about diversity. Then the implementation. To achieve Lifeline's diversity objectives, the board will make this policy available to public through the Lifeline website, disclose in the annual report the proportion of women employees in the whole organisation, women in senior executive positions, and women on the board, disclose in the annual report the diversity profile of our clients who use Lifeline services, encourage and support the application of workplace flexibility policy into practices across the organisation, and actively encourage Lifeline Australia members to develop their own diversity policies. So here, we've got some really big objectives here about making a commitment, about reporting on that commitment, and about measuring and tracking whether we as Lifeline are improving in those areas. Then you've got the board diversity commitments, and I won't go through those, but again, you can read through them if you wish. And we start to see some of those governance commitments embedded within that. And then point 8, management diversity commitments. So this is really where we start talking about the responsibilities of management within Lifeline. So the CEO and so forth. And again, in your workplace, you might simplify all that. If you're a small business, for example, you might simplify that to say, the responsibility of the executives will be this, or you can even be quite clear and say the responsibility of the director or CEO is this, the responsibility of management is this, responsibility of all team members this, and the responsibilities or the KPIs or KRAs around those. KRAs will be the same, but the KPIs might be different. So, for example, the CEO, the responsibility and metric might be around making sure we've got good policies and procedures in place, making sure we've got good governance. The KPIs or the metrics for management might be about implementing, making sure the training is occurring, making sure that it's promoted and fostered in the workplace. And the metrics for employees might be about complying with policy and procedure, reporting breaches through the proper channels and so forth. So again, we can scale this up or down depending what the nature of your business is. Myself personally is to keep it as simple as possible. Some of the best policy statements are one-page statements. Of course, it's no good sacrificing content for clarity. So in some cases, especially if we talk about large organizations that have multiple stakeholders that deal with many complexities, a one-page statement may not necessarily be clear enough in terms of setting an agenda on an issue. So you have to expand further. So you take an organization like Lifeline that has multiple layers of internal and external stakeholders. You can understand why they have to be really quite cautious about the wording and what they say. But if you're looking at a small business like Macmillan, it really would be I suppose superfluous to put in stuff that wasn't necessary. We'd want to keep it as simple as possible so that it's easy for anybody, any stakeholders of Macmillan to understand it, to have access to it, and then to promote it. So both to external stakeholders and other internal stakeholders. So then the final element of this particular one is the annual reporting, and it just talks about how it's going to report on the diversity. Now, this is one example, and I picked this one because it's not the most complex one, and it's not the most simplest one, but it's a really good example of a pretty standard policy on an issue and an organization's statement on where it stands on an issue, and in this case, diversity. So if we're going to be creating a culture of diversity where diversity is embraced and inclusion is important, and we look at our legislative framework, policy really has to be at the forefront of the leadership on this issue, setting good, clear, and compelling vision about where we want to be in this space, in particular in this case diversity, and then have our procedures and our protocols and processes flow out from this. So then from this policy, we have all those procedures such as induction training, other training, reporting mechanisms, dispute resolution mechanisms, all those type of things that come out of this. The other policy I wanted to talk about was the equal opportunity and anti-discrimination policy within organizations. And equal opportunity, as I said earlier, is more about making sure that we remove structural discrimination. So it really is like equal opportunity law is about promoting everybody's rights. So things like equal opportunity, often around things such as recruitment and promotion. And often it's used as well to provide redress for people whose rights have been breached. So it's an opportunity for people to right some wrong, depending on the nature of the discrimination and what's been alleged or investigated or challenged. It could take into account any of those anti-discrimination legislation, such as racial discrimination, sex discrimination, disability discrimination, age discrimination, but also things such as the Fair Work Act as well, which will cover off working conditions. So an equal opportunity and anti-discrimination policy sets out the rights and responsibilities of employers and employees in relation to equal opportunity. So pretty much like we were just talking about with discrimination, but in this case, really focusing on equal opportunity and as well as anti-discrimination. It's often in the equal opportunity policy, it's often the manager's responsibility to ensure that the legislation is permeating through the way that we do business. So it's not it is not appropriate for us as managers to expect our frontline staff or our junior staff to understand the legislation. We can't assume that they come to work understanding what the racial, sex, disability, or age discrimination legislation um, states and what they can and can't do. It's up to us to ensure that they understand that, and we do that by making sure that it permeates through all the structures that we have in the workplace, such as job descriptions or position descriptions, clearly articulate what's expected with them around legislation. Protocols, SOPs, standard or safe operating procedures, or just standard practice procedures are written in a way that promotes inclusion, respect, equal opportunity, and eliminates any form of discrimination. So making sure that structurally our workplaces support inclusive workplaces. So an example of that is around recruitment. So we would have, it's management's responsibility to ensure that our recruitment processes are compliant with our obligations around legislative requirements in this space, but also making sure that it's consistent with best practice. And then that the team is trained to understand these things. So things such as induction training, ongoing training, where there are breaches, they're investigated, and training to improve performance or modify behaviours are put into place. And we'll talk more about that shortly. So this means also including having those mechanisms in place where if the breach occurs, that it's easy and it's accessible for a staff member or an employee to be able to raise a complaint in a way that does not impede them from raising that complaint, so they don't have to jump too many fiery hoops or any fiery hoops to be able to raise the issue, that they can raise it in a way that maintains their personal integrity as well, so that it doesn't add to the burden of the experience. So I just mentioned inclusive recruitment procedures and practices, and I just mentioned about recruitment earlier. So I just want to stop and talk about that, because this is one of the really big areas. And again, this is sourced from the Human Rights Commission website, and I've got the link down there. I thought rather than rewrite it, just get it straight from the horse's mouth. So basically making sure that when we recruit on a merit-based principle. That is, that the best person for the job is selected for the job, regardless of any of those defining characteristics. So that means that when you recruit for a position, that you are not making assumptions about the person's capability based on any of those defining characteristics, such as their gender, their sexual preference, their religious beliefs, their age, whether they have a visible or non-visible disability. You're not making decisions about any of those things. You're actually making decisions about the person's capability to do the task. So let's have a look at this checklist. So from the Human Rights Commission, in terms of inclusive recruitment practices, looking about planning your approach to ensure you comply with your obligations to prevent discrimination in the recruitment process, and making sure that you're clear about what are the capabilities required for this position, what does the ideal candidate have to be able to do to be able to fulfill this position. So that normally means about having a good, robust position description or some type of duty statement, clear about the capability, not about the characteristics that you require. So you're not thinking in your head, oh, I want someone who's this particular age, this particular gender, this particular national background or heritage. You're not thinking about those things. You're saying, I need someone who can do this particular task in this particular way and in this particular time frame, and so forth and so forth, all these characteristics that are required by the role. And once you've got that, you can then start to recruit against it. So making sure that you have a good merit-based recruitment system in place, and that as a manager, you're training all people, or making sure that all people who do recruitment have been trained against that, so that they're educated and understanding merit-based, the risks of making discriminatory decisions, and how to avoid that by following a good process. Um, so, good process is about making sure you have a clear position, making sure that you recruit against that position, that criteria, making sure that you have some form of assessment against the criteria where each candidate is assessed against that objective criteria, and then a decision is made on the person who best demonstrates suitability to that role. So to do that, want to make sure we have that job description clear, make sure that we everyone that's involved, so if it's a panel, everybody understands on the panel what we're doing here, and the due process that we're going through and the appropriate way to do that. We cast the net as widely as possible to make sure that we get as much of a diverse pool of applicants. So, making sure that we just don't, so you're not just advertising in one space that's going to perhaps appeal to one of the demographic. If we want to be if we want to be open and honest about being diverse, we need to think about how we network out there to get to those market segmentations, in this case with people that we're looking for, so as to attract the diversity to apply. And then making sure that we're fair in the way that we treat candidates, and that might be about making proper adjustments. So if we talk about diversity, as I was just talking about earlier about some of the reasonable adjustments to people with disability, or we talk about reasonable adjustments, it might be with people who have English as a second language. Just in general, it's good recruitment practices always to think about the way that you're going about recruitment to get the best candidate for the job. And what I mean by that is that, I'm working with some great organizations at the moment who are looking at how they recruit, because they don't want to recruit people who interview the best. They want to recruit people who can do the job the best. And of course, traditional interview-based recruitment allows people who interview well to get to the top of the list, the merit list in particular. But sometimes they're not the people who are best at doing the job. Sometimes the people who are best at doing the job are really not very great at interviews because nerves or lack of practice or lack of skill in interviewing, which may have absolutely nothing to do with the job that they're applying for, the interview skills. So we think about that in terms of being fair and being still being robust, but being fair in the way that we're casting that net to allow everybody who applies to put their best foot forward. And of course, doing some really good practices, such as making sure that we don't ask questions through the recruitment process that ask people to reveal any personal information that's not relevant to the job. Making sure that we focus on the requirements of the job, and particularly conscious of our biases and any stereotypes in particular. So, and I'm a big believer that stereotypes are a natural process. I mean, our brain is very much a pattern building machine. So, and it's it's used to our advantage in things such as, if we see a pothole when we drive over it and it jars us and it damages our car, we then make a fairly reasonable judgment that the next pothole is going to do the same thing. It may not be as deep, and it might not be as jarring as the previous one, but our brain makes uses that one example to make a prediction about the next one and so forth. So, if your source if your exposure to a particular culture is just through TV, through stereotypes on a TV, and so that makes up 80 to 100% of your interaction with a particular culture, it's natural for your brain to assume that when you actually meet someone in real life from that cultural background, that they're going to be the same as those stereotypes. So it's really from my view, is not to say not to have any stereotypes, but to be always aware that you have them, to be critical of those stereotypes and to always continually remind ourselves that um, that those stereotypes are based usually on some element in terms of ignorance or limits of experience or lack of exposure. So often it is about parking those biases or myths or stereotypes that we have. It's really about making sure that uh, we don't unconsciously just keep accepting those stereotypes. That we're critically thinking to ourselves, okay, I'm making some significant decisions here about individuals, and I need to make sure that I make judgments and I can support all my judgments based on the facts that I'm given in this particular case. So I've got my objective profile for the job. I've got my data gathering tools, which are my questions or my interviews or whatever the case may be, and I'm going to measure up those responses with the requirements and make my decision based on that. Keep records of my decision, and then, of course, that will lead me to selecting the best suited candidate for the role. The other point around policy that I want to talk about is the need for constant review. Social expectations change, legislation change, management practice change, staff and clients and their needs and their expectations change, and all these things can have an impact on our organization. So it impacts on our values as an organization, and that impacts on our behaviors. So that then means that it's going to impact on our culture, and it should have an impact on our policies. So if we just do a policy once, lock it in forever, it's not going to be a living, breathing document that changes as the environment changes. And we want it to be organic. We want it to be living, breathing. We want it to be constantly evolving as all these other change forces have an impact on especially in this case, in the space of diversity and inclusion. So outdated policies become ineffective when changes both internal, such as management changes or cultural changes or directional changes by the organization, or external, such as legislative changes or social norms and expectations or technology or even our investors. Whenever any of those changes occur, our policies are at risk of becoming outdated. So we have to constantly go back and review them. And the way that we do that is by making sure that when we do a policy, that we have a review point in. And usually the review point is 12 months. In areas where there's greater volatility or change, we may make it shorter, 6 months. If it's a more stable area, we may make it 24 months. But usually the rule of thumb is policies to be reviewed every 12 months, to have a look, to analyze the data. Has it been doing its job? Has it been missing any key points? And do we need to make any adjustments as a result of that? And importantly, as part of that, is making sure that we go back to the key stakeholders and gather feedback in terms of how's it going? Is our policy and our procedures and protocols, are those things doing their job, or do we need to update them? Do we need to tweak it? Do we need to add something? And we can do that through things like staff and customer surveys and questionnaires. We can do training events and then have mechanisms in place to engage with people and get feedback from them through those. Making sure that we look at data coming into our organization, such as customer or staff complaints being raised, the results of those investigations and outcomes of those investigations. We can look at things such as the mix of our workforce and seeing whether policy is actually driving a more diverse workforce or not. We can look at things like exit surveys from staff leaving the organization and have a look at the reasons why they're leaving. Does that have to do with anything to do with our culture or culture around diversity or inclusion? And as we saw from some the Lifeline points and statements in there, have a look at some of the targets that we set in there. Some of those might be around affirmative action targets and so forth. See how we're performing against those. And then that all feeds into a policy review. So often as a manager within an organization, you gather your data, you do your review, you consult widely with the appropriate people, and you put together a review report that then would go up to the senior manager for approval to change, or in some cases the board. Uh, and in the components of that report would be something like, the policy name and the reason for the review, and it might be a time, or there's been a significant complaint made about its lack of effectiveness. The reviewer's details, who's the review done by, or who was involved with it. You'd give a background on the general policies performance over the period, and any areas that have been identified for consideration. You would then share in the report the data, the significant data that you've captured, and what that means, and then that would feed into your recommendations. You would identify if if there is an impact on any other business areas or policy areas in terms of what you're suggesting or recommending, and also notify if any other stakeholders need to be, or identify if any other stakeholders need to be identified of what you're recommending. And that would feed into a typical policy review report to be approved by the relevant individual or body